So it's a completely separate subject.
Okay.
I'm very interested in you as an individual.
Okay.
Getting profound.
We're putting the camera on you now. On your own channel.
Battery's getting low. All right, the heat's on me now. Go on, have to be fair. Yep.
You've spent time in Palestine.
Yes.
You would describe yourself definitely as pro-Palestinian. Maybe historically describe yourself as anti-Zionist.
Yes.
Maybe that's something you've reflected on.
I've been reflecting on that.
My question for you, and it's a question I like asking every pro-Palestinian activist, you chose this conflict over far bigger conflicts, far longer conflicts, far more brutal conflicts. Like, I could ask you questions on Somalia, Sudan. I would imagine, maybe you do, because it's only based on history of speaking to other people, you know very little about these conflicts. So why did you pick on the Israel-Palestine conflict over all the... Why did you choose to focus on this one over all of the others? Because I've seen you walking around with a kafir, which is a sign of Palestinian resistance, but I haven't seen you walking around with any Sudanese or Central African Republic or Eritrean clothing. Tibet, yeah. And so I don't mean to flip. It's something I like to... Because I want to understand why the world is obsessed on us.
So Josie's asking me why I chose Palestine over the many causes of liberation throughout the world, and I was saying that I'm from a left-wing family. My parents spent time in Israel in the 70s before I was born on a kibbutz, which is perhaps the only place in the world where true communism has ever succeeded, where everyone does share everything equally. Sounds like maybe you disagree.
No, I lived on a kibbutz.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I think it's just a series of personal fiefdoms.
Okay, there you go.
My opinion.
Well,
Says the man who refuses to debate on
come and
camera.
have a chat, man.
He
Come and
likes
have a
to
chat.
heckle, but not on camera. Sign of an intellectual powerhouse.
And he's
Sorry.
That's right. Yeah.
You want to be Adam at the start.
Yeah. So
Too far.
my parents are left wing. The left wing often support Palestine. It's seen as a David and Goliath situation, which I think, in terms of power, it certainly is. Israel is much more.
But do you not agree that
powerful.
I mean, the Palestinians historically, maybe there's a degree of lip service from the leadership, but they do have the might of the Arab world, and the Arab world does have considerable political clout, which backs the Palestinians certainly in international fora, and also financially in terms of funding.
As you said, pays lip service.
I mean, I agree. There's a large element of his lip service, but there's also a large element of it is funding.
Every time Israel's been invaded, it's been by Arab armies, not by the Palestinians. I agree, are not a powerful force.
Yeah.
They never have been. They've always been used by far more powerful Arab nations who had ambitions for the land. But I think rather than going into Israel-Palestine, I think it's more interesting on you. So you're saying you come from a left-wing household, and so this was a conflict that they focused on, and this is something that I've experienced. If you are on the left, I would describe it as almost, there's I don't know how many, let's say 10 commandments, or the 5 commandments of the left. One, you have to be pro-Palestinian. Okay. You have to be pro-choice. You have to be for gay rights. You have to be for the redistribution of wealth. That fact is in there somewhere, but much lower down the pecking order. You have to be, if you're in America, you have to be for gun control. There's certain ideas, and for me what's really confusing, I can understand why some of those made their way as being a character trait of being on the left. What I find very perplexing is why Israel-Palestine finds itself there, because as you described, Israel in its infancy was a socialist enterprise. It was founded by socialists. Some of the most successful manifestations of communism took place in Israel. Yet at some point the left moved away from Israel. Now I have my theories, but what I'm really interested in is from your perspective. Your parents stayed in Israel, and yet still they raised you in an environment where you, or they as well, became hostile to Israel. So what happened?
Well, my dad said that he saw mistreatment of Arab people in Israel, and having gone to the kibbutz hoping to find a place of sanctuary where everyone was treated equal, thought that the Arabs in that region weren't being treated equal in the Jewish state. I mean, that's anecdotal evidence.
Yeah.
That's what he saw, and I think a lot of the Palestinian supporters will often pick on what happens to Arab-Israeli citizens, but there's racism in every country, and that's not going to be solved. My issue is the occupation. We can go into that if you want to probably take a long time, but there's a occupation there that international law disagrees with, and I think
I take issue with that.
Just before we go there, what's your position on Cyprus and Tibet?
I think Cyprus was illegally invaded by the Turkish people, and I would be with the Greek Cypriots. Oh, long story short, I'd be with the Greek Cypriots.
What about Crimea? As an interesting thing, that's an area that's historically part of Russia, which essentially was signed over. You know, I don't know if you know the history of Crimea. It was.
Pavlov and I spoke about it at one point. It was signed over to Ukraine, and then it went back to being part of Russia.
Well, no, it was signed. Well, it's gone back to being part of Russia because the Russians invaded it and annexed it. But it was signed over.
Vote took place, right?
It was signed over by Khrushchev, who was Ukrainian, on the 50th anniversary of the Soviet Union when he was basically drunk, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Soviet Union, and he signed a decree portioning it to Ukraine.
Yeah.
So there's. So I just wonder how you would look at that as.
I look at that as the people of Crimea voting to rejoin Russia, like the people of Scotland could have voted to be independent had they wanted to.
So the main focus of these is
my
main focus.
15-minute max. Hey? Okay, one sec. All right, boss.
Mohammed, it's nice to meet you.
Yes. Okay. Good to see you. Good to see you. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
And so my main focus is more there are brutal occupations around the world. There is entire Tibet nobody talks about, but the Han people are now I think the biggest demographic within there. Nobody.
Can I introduce a point?
Yeah.
Possibly just to do partially with the publication. How do you say it? Oh, it's going out of my mind now. It's very well known, this conflict. While information about Tibet is not very well known.
Public awareness.
That's it. Thanks.
Perfect. And why? Why is this one well known? That's the point. That's what I'm trying to get down. Why did his family? So power plays. Okay. So let's explore the power plays. Yeah. So Israel, in its infancy, wasn't a powerful state. I'm sure we all agree with that. It was survivors of the Holocaust and survivors of Arab expulsion of Jews. So we're not talking a powerful people in its infancy compared to the entire might of the Arab world. So today, when you talk about power plays, who are you talking about? Because it can't be about historical, it has to be about the present then. And
I mean, I suggested it as an idea.
Okay.
One thing
I've thought about it.
One thing I find interesting is that if you look at you can disagree over the rights and wrongs and the legal aspects, but I think if you actually look in terms of human rights abuses, I think if you're reasonably objective, that aside from the question of sovereignty, which are kind of quite abstract discussions, that if you look at the scale of human rights abuses, Israel's quite low down on the list. Like
is this whataboutery though?
No, it's not what. No,
the fact that people steal cars doesn't mean I should steal.
I'm not saying it's whataboutery. I'm saying that what I find interesting is that because of that, if you look, for example, the death toll in the conflict in over 100 years is I think it's around about 70,000 on both sides, which basically in terms of international conflicts is obviously not saying that that's not.
What's the ratio of that?
But forget the ratios. I don't think the ratios are important because I'm not bringing up.
The death toll.
The total death toll of both sides. So that's including Israelis and Arabs. So
if you want to talk death tolls, how many Americans and Britons died in the Iraq War? That's a real death toll. That's a real proportion. Yeah. But you're not. But people. Yeah.
But that's not my point. So my point is that if you look at the kind of the scale of human rights in China, I find it very interesting that it's quite easy for people to build a coalition that wants to boycott Israel on a kind of arcane political point about who should have sovereignty in a particular area, but actually if you look at the day-to-day lives, and I've lived there and I've worked with Arabs, and the ones that I've met, that most of them agree that they'd actually had it better under Israeli rule.
This is in Israel.
This is in Israel.
That's why I make the distinction between Israel proper and
No, I'm
what's
talking
happening
about-
in the
No, but in the West Bank it's the same.
I'm talking about Arab. I worked in construction, so Arab labourers that were coming from the West Bank. Coming from the West Bank to work in Israel, and they almost universally agreed that first of all they hate Abu Mazen because he's so corrupt, and secondly they say that actually life was, they couldn't say it at home, but they said life is better under the Israeli rule.
Then why not just extend Israeli rule to the whole of the region that Israel controls?
Because that would then make them Israeli.
Yeah.
And that's
Israeli
not what
Arabs.
people who advocate for the Palestinians want.
Well,
Hey, he wants that.
He wants that.
I support that. I support one
okay.
state.
One state.
So my position is that if historically Palestine, mandatory Palestine was what's now Israel and Jordan, and I think if Palestinians, there's already one Arab state that's been created from the mandate of Palestine, and that's called Jordan. And I think there's no need for a third state. Also, and the other reason that I have an objection is I think that if you actually look at the type of state that's likely to come into existence, it's likely to be some kind of dictatorship. It's likely to be fairly repressive, to be anti-gay rights, anti-women's rights, and I think that I find it hard to believe why people would advocate for the creation of that kind of society. I know
that's what you envisage a Palestinian state might be like.
I mean, if you look in Gaza, that's exactly what Palestine. If the only reason Abu Mazen is still in power is because Israel controls the West Bank. If Israel was not in control of the West Bank, Hamas would take over within probably a week or a maximum 2 weeks, and that's considered common knowledge amongst people with a security background.
Just to add into that, the last elections you had amongst the Palestinians was 12 years ago. So this links back to my original point, which I was trying to
12
make.
years ago, but that's more recent than in most Arab countries.
And this all links back to my.
It was the only, I think, legitimate, free, and fair election in any Arab country.
So I'm going to put forward a theory. I'm going to put forward a theory as to why your parents became anti-Israel from being pro-Israel, and it's to do with how the left views the world. They view it through a power matrix. You're either an oppressor
David or Goliath.
or an oppressed. You're either David or Goliath. Great analogy. And what happened, it's not around values. It's no longer about this group of people. They have a similar value set to us. Within this society, there's equality. Within this society, there's a higher standard of living. It becomes down to literally, are you an oppressed or are you an oppressor? So coming out of the Holocaust, the left had huge sympathy for the Jewish people. And so Israel was seen positively by most people on the left. But what happened was Israel defeated the Arab invaders in 48. 8 Arab armies attacked Israel. Israel repelled them and survived. 67, a similar story happened. Israel survived. 73. And so literally, Israel kept winning these wars, and suddenly this downtrodden Holocaust became powerful and became the oppressor, and the left switched. And suddenly, we became the bad guys. Now, what's the danger of that? The danger is exactly what we're now seeing manifest in left-wing circles. You will see on a pro-Palestinian march or on an anti-cuts demonstration, you will see an Islamist who believes that gay people should be thrown off roofs, marching side by side in solidarity with an LGBT activist.
And it's crazy.
And it's because we've moved, and it's because we've moved away from associating with people who have similar values or values that we'd like to see shared, distributed throughout the world, and instead it focuses on this weird dynamic, which are you oppressed? Because the danger of that theory is nobody is going to be oppressed forever, and if you advocate for the oppressed person to rise above their oppressor, they will do. And when they do that, you'll then reject them and spit them out, which is what happened to the Jewish people, in my opinion.
Well, you're a white male, so we can't listen to you.
Excuse me. Why do you assume that he's male?
Well, yes.
Did you just assume my gender?
He could have identified.
We're going to get
as a woman.
complaints from all angles now. It's a strange world, and I think the points you make about Islamists being on the same side as others is very strong. I look back on the time when my parents were in that region. It was Arab nationalism was a secular, non-religious phenomenon, and the Palestinians have lost that to their cost. I think, and to the cost, to the detriment of the region.
Well, I will just add one thing. In my experience, the overwhelming majority of Palestinians that I meet, I get on fine with. They want peace. The majority of settlers I meet, I get on fine with. They want peace. And I think the biggest issue is the entire West. The Muslim world is a problem. The Jewish world is a problem. America, Britain, Europe, the Arab world were all problems. Why? Because we all focus and make Israel and Palestine our cause. We make it our issue, and that's why it remains in the spotlight.
It should be for the people of that region to decide.
I think they'd find peace if it was left to them.
Well said, well said. Guys, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Perfect.
And can I say one thing?
Yeah.
I'd just like to congratulate you. This will be good for your YouTube
it
channel
will.
for being a calm and open-minded
Thank
person
you
that's
very
willing
much.
to have
I really
a
appreciate
rational
that.
discussion,
Thank you.
because it's very unusual in this day and age.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the audience. Nice one, gentlemen. Thank you. And see you. Content over everything.
That's his content.
Lovely. Nice one, gentlemen. Thank you.